The bones were found first, not buried with care, not wrapped in cloth or prayer, but scattered behind a collapsed cabin where the earth had sunk inward like a mouth that finally gave up holding its secrets. Small bones, infant bones, some charred, some gnawed, some fused together in ways that made the men who uncovered them avert their eyes and spit into the dirt. The forest around the cabin was silent, as if it had already said everything it intended to say decades earlier, and now refused to repeat itself. Those mountains had always known how to keep quiet. People who grew up there said the land remembered things the way flesh remembers pain. Long after the wound closed, the ache remained. You could feel it when the fog rolled low and thick, when the trees creaked like old joints, when the wind slipped through hollows and sounded too much like breathing. This was one of those places, a place where the ground itself seemed to recoil from what had been done upon it. The cabin had no name on any map that still survived. County records listed the property only as uninhabitable. The ink faded, the edges burned. Locals didn't need paper to remember it. They remembered the screams that used to come down the mountain at night, thin and strangled, like someone trying not to be heard. They remembered the smoke that sometimes rose without a fire, and the child's footprints that appeared in the snow each winter, too many for one body, circling the house and then stopping abruptly at the tree line. No one went up there anymore. Not since the fire, not since the church bells rang without anyone pulling the rope. Before any of that, before the whispers hardened into warnings, there was a girl. She was born during a winter when the creek froze solid and the road vanished under snowdrifts so deep they swallowed fences whole. She cried with a voice that sounded wrong somehow, too old, too steady, as if she already understood the shape of suffering. The midwife never spoke of what she saw that night, only crossed herself whenever the child's name was mentioned and refused to climb that mountain again. They said the girl grew fast, too fast, that she learned to stand before she learned to crawl, and to watch before she learned to speak. They said she never played with other children, only stared at them from behind trees, her eyes pale and unblinking, her hands always clenched as if holding something invisible. And they said her father never let her out of his sight. Before we go any further, pause with me for a moment. Which city are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Because the hour matters with stories like this. These are not meant for bright rooms or open windows. These are the kinds of accounts that were whispered after lamps were blown out, when names could no longer be seen on faces, and family trees began to twist back into themselves. The road to that cabin did not disappear by accident. It was erased, and the girl who lived there would grow up to become something the mountains themselves seemed to reject. The town below the mountain was barely a town at all. A handful of buildings pressed together along a narrow creek, a church with warped pews, a general store that smelled of kerosene and cured meat, and a courthouse that locked its doors more often than it opened them. Old maps called the place by a name that no one used anymore. New maps left it blank. It existed in a fold between ridgelines, a place passed through rather than arrived at, and even then only by those who had no choice. In the early decades of the 20th century, isolation was not unusual there. Roads washed out every spring and vanished entirely in winter. Families stayed where they were born, married who was available, buried their dead on slopes too steep for plows or markers. Outsiders came rarely, and when they did, they left with a sense of having stepped somewhere they were not meant to linger. The cabin sat miles above that settlement, beyond the last fence post and the final stand of managed timber. It had been built by hands that understood the forest too well, logs fitted so tightly that even wind struggled to enter. Behind it, the land fell away sharply into a ravine choked with briars and deadfall. In front, the slope opened just enough to catch the morning light, though the sun never seemed to stay long. County birth ledgers from that era list a single entry connected to the property. The ink is cramped, the handwriting uneven, as if the clerk hesitated while writing it. No mother's name, no witnesses, only the father's surname and a date that coincided with one of the coldest winters on record. Later annotations, added years afterward in a different hand, are scratched out, burned at the edges, or simply missing. Church records are worse, pages torn cleanly from the binding, margins stained dark, as if something had soaked through and been hastily wiped away. One surviving note, written by a pastor who did not stay long in the region, mentions a child of troubling countenance and a household closed to God and man alike. After that, the handwriting stops mid-sentence. Those who remembered the girl as a child described her as quiet, but not shy. She watched people the way animals watch, assessing, memorizing. When spoken to, she answered politely, but her voice never rose or fell. There was no laughter in it, no fear either. E said she spoke like someone much older, using words she could not have learned from anyone nearby. Her father told people she was sickly and needed to be kept close, that the mountain air was the only thing that agreed with her. He did not let her attend church. He did not let her play. When she was seen at all, it was walking behind him, head lowered, hands red and raw from cold even in summer. At night, lights sometimes flickered in the cabin long after everyone else had gone dark. Shadows moved behind the small windows in patterns that did not match a single body. And on certain evenings, when the fog pressed low and sound carried too far, the town heard a child crying, and an adult voice answering it from inside the same throat. No one went up the mountain to ask questions, not yet. The girl was 7 when the animals started dying. It began with chickens from the nearest homestead below the ridge, found stiff in their coops, necks twisted too far, eyes pecked out with a precision that suggested hands not predators. Then goats vanished, leaving only drag marks in the frost that led uphill and ended abruptly where the ground hardened into stone. Dogs refused to follow those trails. They would whine, pull back, and sometimes bare their teeth at nothing at all. When townspeople spoke of it, they kept their voices low, as if the mountain might be listening. Someone mentioned the cabin. Someone else said the child was wrong. The words hung there, heavy and unfinished. Around that time, the schoolteacher, new to the region, still unaware of what questions should remain unasked, reported seeing the girl standing at the edge of the road one morning. Alone, barefoot, her dress too thin for the cold. When the teacher stopped the car and asked if she was lost, the girl tilted her head and said, very calmly, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Then she asked what a mirror blood was. The teacher laughed, uneasy, and asked where she had heard that phrase. The girl pointed back toward the trees. When the teacher followed her gesture, the child was already gone. Inside the cabin, something had begun to change. Neighbors noticed smoke rising at odd hours, carrying a bitter smell that stung the eyes. Ash drifted down into the lower fields like gray snow. A man who hunted near the ridge claimed he heard chanting one night, not words exactly, but a rhythm, punctuated by pauses that sounded like breathing through clenched teeth. The girl stopped aging the way children do. Her body grew, but unevenly. Her limbs lengthened too fast, her joints swollen and stiff. Some days she moved like someone twice her age. Other days she lay still for hours, staring at the ceiling, whispering to herself in a voice that did not sound like her own. When she came down to town with her father, rare but impossible to forget, people noticed the way she flinched when he touched her shoulder, then leaned into him a second later as if pulled by something stronger than fear. It was during one of those visits that a woman from the church noticed bruises on the girl's wrists, finger-shaped, deep. When she tried to speak to her, the father answered instead, his voice flat, his eyes unblinking. He said the child hurt herself in her sleep. He said she had bad dreams. He said God had given him a difficult burden. That winter, the creek ran black for days. Fish floated to the surface, their bodies bloated and split. Children were kept indoors. Doors were barred at night. And from the mountain, the screams returned, no longer muffled, no longer careful. They came in waves, sometimes a child's voice, sometimes a man's, sometimes both tangled together so tightly it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Drawings began to appear, scratched into fence posts, carved into the doors of outbuildings, shapes that looked like family trees, except the branches curled back inward, crossing, knotting, consuming themselves. At the center of each was a crude figure with 2 faces sharing one skull, the girl's face, and beneath it always the same mark, a circle scored through with a line, over and over again, as if someone were trying to cut a lineage in half and failing every time. By the time the girl turned 13, the town had begun to treat the mountain as a boundary rather than a place. Paths that once led upward were left to rot. Fences were rebuilt facing inward, as if to guard against something descending. People stopped, saying the family's name out loud. When they had to refer to the cabin, they called it that place, and even that felt like an invocation. Puberty did not arrive in the girl the way it did in others. It came in fragments, sudden bleeding that lasted weeks, long stretches where she did not eat, episodes when she clawed at her own skin until it bruised, muttering words that sounded like names being counted and recounted. A traveling nurse was summoned once, only once. She returned pale and shaking, refused payment, and burned her notes before leaving town at dawn. After that, no one else went up there willingly. The father began keeping the girl indoors entirely. Windows were shuttered. The door was barred from the outside at night. On certain evenings, candlelight flickered through the cracks, and shadows moved against the walls in ways that suggested more than two bodies. The chanting grew louder, more structured. It followed a pattern the older residents recognized from half-remembered sermons and older still burial rites, rites meant to bind bloodlines, not cleanse them. Sometimes, late at night, the girl was seen standing at the tree line, alone. Her hair hung loose down her back, matted and unevenly cut. Her body bore the signs of a woman, but her face still held something childlike, stretched and wrong. She spoke to no one, only stared down at the lights below, her lips moving silently, as if practicing a confession that would never be accepted. It was during this IOD that the first child was born. There is no official record of the birth. What exists instead are fragments. A blood-stained sheet buried near the ravine, a cradle found months later smashed and burned, and the testimony of a man who lived closest to the mountain, who swore he heard an infant crying for 3 days straight, then stopping all at once. After that silence, the screaming returned, sharper, more frantic. The girl was seen again in town weeks later, walking stiffly, her abdomen flat once more. When someone asked where the baby was, she answered without hesitation that it had gone back into the ground, where it already knew the shape of things. The father aged rapidly after that. His back bent, his hands shook. He began drinking heavily, though no one ever saw where he got the liquor. The girl, meanwhile, seemed to harden. Her gaze sharpened, her posture straightened. It was as if something inside her had settled into place, something old and patient. More children followed. Not all survived. Those that did were never seen for long. Occasionally, small figures were glimpsed near the cabin windows, faces pressed to the glass, features distorted, eyes too close together, limbs twisted at impossible angles. Then they vanished. The townspeople convinced themselves they were tricks of light, reflections, anything but the truth. Because by then, the truth had begun to form a shape too unbearable to hold, and the family tree, already rotting at the roots, was folding in on itself completely. The truth did not arrive all at once. It seeped out slowly, the way rot does, softening what it touches until the structure can no longer hold its shape. It began with a ledger no one remembered keeping, found behind the altar during repairs to the church roof, its pages stuck together with age and something darker. Names repeated themselves too closely. Birth dates overlapped in ways that made no sense. One surname appeared where a mother's name should have been. A father's name appeared twice on the same line, once where it belonged, once where it never should have been. Those who studied the pages felt a sickness settle in their stomachs. The family tree did not branch. It looped. Whispers followed. Old ones, pulled from memories people had trained themselves to forget. Someone remembered the girl's mother dying young, long before the cabin shut itself off from the world. Someone else remembered the father refusing help, refusing visitors, refusing even a coffin when she was buried. There had been talk back then, quickly smothered. A widower alone with a daughter, a mountain that kept its distance, a town that looked away. Now the pieces aligned. The girl was not merely his child, she was his continuation, his possession, and the children born from her were not accidents of isolation or misfortune. They were the result of a bloodline feeding on itself, again and again, until distinction between parent and offspring collapsed entirely. Realization spread through the town like a bruise surfacing under skin. People avoided one another's eyes. The church bells rang without announcement, summoning a meeting that no one would later admit attending. Words like sin and abomination were spoken, but always quietly, as if naming the thing too loudly might make it real in a way that demanded action. And action did come. One night, just before winter closed the roads for good, a group of men climbed the mountain with lanterns and fuel. They did not knock. They did not call out names. Flames licked up the cabin walls quickly, hungrily, as if the wood had been waiting for this ending. Screams cut through the night, high, low, overlapping, until smoke swallowed them whole. By morning nothing remained but blackened beams and a scorched hollow where the cabin had stood. No bodies were recovered. The ravine behind the house had collapsed inward during the fire, burying whatever had been thrown into it years earlier. Animals were slaughtered in the days that followed, their carcasses burned. Records disappeared, pages were torn out, names were erased. The town told itself the problem had been solved, but some things do not burn clean. In the weeks after the fire, people reported seeing a woman-shaped figure near the ruins, standing motionless in the snow. Others heard a child crying beneath the wind, and more than one person woke from dreams of tangled branches and two faces sharing one skull, whispering the same scent. Ents over and over again. You cannot destroy a lineage by pretending it never existed. You can only hide it long enough for someone else to find it. For nearly 3 decades after the fire, the mountain was left alone. Trees crept back over the scar where the cabin had stood. Ash mixed with soil, and what remained of the ravine settled into a shallow depression that collected rainwater and leaves. New families moved into the lower valley, unaware of why certain plots were never sold, why survey lines bent strangely around that slope. The older residents carried the knowledge in their bodies rather than their mouths. Some drank themselves into early graves. Others clung to scripture with a desperation that bordered on panic. A few kept boxes under their beds filled with things they could not bring themselves to destroy, photographs without names, scraps of paper with dates circled in red, a child's shoe too small to belong to anyone they admitted knowing. Occasionally, someone would ask about the fire. The answer was always the same: lightning, an accident, an old cabin finally giving up. And if the questioner pressed too hard, the conversation ended. In the early 1980s, a man came to town with a different kind of curiosity. He was not local. His accent placed him somewhere north of the ridge lines, his manner careful, restrained. He introduced himself as a genealogist, working on a regional study of Appalachian family structures. He asked about marriage patterns, inheritor, NCE, birth anomalies. Questions that made people shift in their chairs and glance toward the mountain without realizing they were doing it. At first he was given nothing, polite answers, closed doors. But persistence has a way of unsettling old silences. He spent hours in the county courthouse, piecing together fragments from damaged ledgers and mislabeled files. He visited churches in neighboring towns, comparing baptismal records. Slowly, a pattern emerged, one that bent inward, collapsing toward a single point that the official maps still left blank. It was in a forgotten storage room beneath the courthouse that he found the box. Inside were charred documents salvaged from the fire and never properly catalogued. A birth ledger with multiple entries scratched out and rewritten, a medical note describing repeated congenital deformities consistent with direct consanguinity, and a bundle of photographs wrapped in oilcloth. The images were grainy, poorly composed. A cabin on a mountainside, a man with hollow eyes standing too close to a girl who did not look away from the camera. And children, some blurred, some painfully clear. Limbs twisted, faces doubled in strange ways. One photograph showed a young woman staring straight into the lens, her expression unreadable, her hands resting protectively over her abdomen. Behind her stood the man, his hand placed where a father's hand should never be. The genealogist later wrote that he felt as if the photographs were watching him rather than the other way around. He left town shortly after, but not before making copies. And what he uncovered would suggest that the fire had not ended the bloodline at all. It had only driven it underground. The genealogist never published his findings under his own name. What exists instead are citations, footnotes in obscure journals, redacted references in university archives, a handful of cassette tapes labeled only with dates and a county code. In those recordings, his voice is low, careful, as if he is afraid of being overheard even years later. He speaks of patterns that refuse to end, of bloodlines that curve back toward their origin like rivers finding old channels beneath the earth. He describes visiting a psychiatric hospital 2 counties over, where a woman in her 40s had been admitted after wandering out of the forest barefoot and disoriented. Her Sue, a name matched one of the erased names from the ledger. Her eyes, according to the intake notes, were pale blue and unsettlingly familiar. DNA testing was primitive then, expensive and rare, but not impossible. A sample was taken quietly, compared against stored bloodwork from a child born with severe abnormalities decades earlier. The match was not linear, it was recursive. Mother and sister, father and grandfather, roles collapsing into one another until the language itself began to fail. The woman spoke little. When she did, she talked about a mountain that breathed at night, about a house that burned but never stopped being there, about children who came from her body already knowing her name. She drew the same symbol over and over again on the walls of her room, a circle split by a line that never quite reached the edge. The genealogist noted that when asked about her parents, she answered with a single word, same. After that, access to the records tightened, files were sealed, tapes went missing. The genealogist's last known correspondence mentions pressure from multiple institutions to let sleeping histories lie. He retired soon after. His personal papers were donated to a library that later suffered a flood, destroying most of the collection. But copies survive, fragments surface, and in the margins of those documents, written in a hand that does not match the genealogist's, are notes added later. She did not die in the fire, the children did not all die. The mountain keeps what is fed to it. The town below the ridge still exists, though smaller now. Few remember why certain areas are avoided. Fewer still remember the name of the family. But sometimes, hikers report finding old carvings on trees, almost grown over, almost erased. Sometimes a child is born with eyes too close together, or hands that curl inward at rest, and the doctors cannot quite explain why. And sometimes on winter nights, lights appear high on the slope where no house stands anymore. In the early 1990s, a graduate student researching Appalachian folklore came across one of the genealogist's citations. It led nowhere official, just a reference number and a county abbreviation that no longer existed on state maps. Curious, she drove south, following the paper trail until the roads narrowed and then dissolved into gravel and memory. She found the town quiet, wary. People answered questions, politely but vaguely, as if they had rehearsed forgetting. When she asked about the mountain, conversations ended. When she showed copies of the photographs, faces closed. One woman crossed herself and whispered a prayer mean. Tea for the dying. The student hiked the slope alone. Near the top, she found the depression where the cabin had once stood. The ground there was unnaturally bare, resisting plant life despite decades of neglect. In the center lay a shallow pool of dark water, its surface unbroken by wind. Around it, half buried in soil, were bones, small, fused, unmistakably human. She recorded everything, photographed the site, took soil samples, and beneath a layer of ash and leaf rot, she uncovered something else, a doorframe, charred, warped but intact, and carved into the wood, dozens of times over, was the same symbol found in the records, the drawings, the hospital walls, a lineage mark, a refusal to end. That night, she camped lower on the mountain. She later wrote that she dreamed of a woman with a girl's face and a girl with a woman's body, standing together in a burning room that never collapsed. They spoke in unison, asking her to remember them correctly. The student left before dawn. Her thesis was never completed. She changed fields. But years later, she admitted to a colleague that she still woke from dreams of tangled branches and mirrored blood, that she sometimes caught herself tracing a circle with her finger, stopping just short of closing it. Because the story was not finished. It had only learned to wait. There are families whose histories move forward in time, branching outward, thinning as they go, and then there are others, ones that turn inward, feeding on. their own beginnings, mistaking familiarity for destiny. The mountain still stands. The trees have grown back. Children play in the valley below, unaware of why their grandparents lower their voices when the fog comes in thick and low. The cabin is gone, but the shape it pressed into the land remains, a negative space the earth has not forgotten how to hold. Somewhere, records still exist, in basements, in mislabeled boxes, in blood, and somewhere, perhaps closer than anyone would like to believe, a person is growing up with questions they do not yet know how to ask, looking into a mirror and seeing too much of someone else looking back, feeling the pull of a history that insists on repeating itself, because when a family tree folds in on itself, it does not end. It waits. So consider this quietly, without answering out loud.